Settle in, close your eyes, and let us take you on a journey through time. Long before the Great Pyramids rose above the waters of Lake Texcoco, before the mighty empire stretched across Mesoamerica, there existed a wandering people. They called themselves the Mexica, though history would remember them as the Aztecs. Their story begins not in grandeur, but in humble migration, guided by dreams and prophecy. According to their sacred traditions, the Mexica originated from a place called Aztlán, somewhere in northern Mexico. The exact location remains shrouded in mystery, perhaps deliberately so, as myths often conceal as much as they reveal. Aztlán was described as an island in a lake, a peaceful homeland where 7 tribes lived together. But peace was not to last forever. The god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird deity of war and sun, spoke to the priests in visions. He commanded his chosen people to leave their comfortable homeland and journey south. They were to search for a specific sign, an eagle perched upon a cactus devouring a serpent. Where they found this omen, there they would build their great city and establish their dominion. And so, around the year 1100 CE, the journey began. The Mexica were not alone in their migration. They traveled with other Nahua-speaking peoples, sharing languages and customs, yet maintaining their distinct identity. The road south was long and arduous, stretching over generations. Children grew into adults who would never see the promised land. Those adults became elders, passing down the prophecy to their own children. The migrants faced countless hardships. They traversed harsh deserts where water was scarce and the sun beat down mercilessly. They crossed mountains where the air grew thin and cold winds cut through their cotton garments. Along the way, they stopped at various sites, sometimes for years at a time, planting crops, building temporary settlements, and then moving on when their god called them forward once more. During these wandering years, the Mexica were not welcomed by the peoples whose lands they crossed. They were seen as uncivilized nomads, barbarians from the north who knew nothing of the sophisticated cultures that had flourished in central Mexico for centuries. The great city of Teotihuacan had already risen and fallen. The Toltecs had built their magnificent capital at Tula and watched it crumble. Powerful city-states dotted the Valley of Mexico, each with its own ruler, its own gods, its own jealously guarded territories. The Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico around 1250 CE, but their troubles were far from over. The fertile lands around the lakes were already claimed by established powers. The newcomers were forced to settle in marginal areas, unwanted and despised by their neighbors. They served as mercenaries for more powerful cities, fighting other people's wars in exchange for small parcels of land and temporary protection. For a time, they settled at Chapultepec, a rocky hill with freshwater springs. But even this modest foothold was too much for the surrounding cities to tolerate. The Mexica were attacked, defeated, and scattered. Some were taken as slaves. Their situation seemed hopeless. They were a people without a homeland, refugees in a land that wanted nothing to do with them. But the prophecy remained alive in the hearts of the priests and the faithful. Huitzilopochtli had promised them greatness. They needed only to persevere, to maintain their faith, to watch for the sign. The year was 1325 CE. The Mexica, beaten down but not broken, had taken refuge in the marshlands of Lake Texcoco. These were lands nobody else wanted, swampy, mosquito-infested islands with no solid ground for farming, no stone for building. But it was here, in this unpromising place, that a priest saw the vision. On a small island, growing from a rock, stood a nopal cactus. Upon this cactus sat a magnificent eagle. Its wings spread wide and in its talons and beak writhed a serpent. The prophecy was fulfilled. This would be the site of their great city, Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus. The founding of Tenochtitlan was an act of extraordinary determination and ingenuity. The Mexica took their unpromising swampland and transformed it through sheer will and innovative engineering. They drove wooden stakes deep into the lakebed, creating foundations. They built chinampas, artificial islands made by piling up mud and vegetation from the lake bottom. creating fertile gardens that seemed to float on the water. These chinampas would become one of the most productive agricultural systems ever devised. Long rectangular plots were separated by canals, allowing farmers to travel by canoe and irrigate their crops with lake water. The rich mud provided constant fertility. On these floating gardens, the Mexica grew maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, and flowers. The chinampas could produce multiple harvests per year, far more food than traditional farming methods. But farming alone would not build an empire. The early Mexica and Tenochtitlan were still weak, still vulnerable. They remained vassals of the powerful city of Azcapotzalco, paying tribute to its ruler, the Tepanec lord, who controlled much of the western valley of Mexico. The Mexica paid their tribute in fish and fowl from the lake, and in the services of their warriors. During this time of subservience, the Mexica learned. They observed the politics of the valley, understanding how alliances were formed and broken, how power shifted between cities. They absorbed the culture and knowledge of the civilizations around them, adopting and adapting religious practices, architectural styles, and political systems. The young city grew slowly but steadily. Causeways were constructed, connecting the island to the mainland. These engineering marvels stretched for miles across the lake, built wide enough for many people to walk abreast. They included removable wooden bridges that could be lifted to prevent enemy forces from reaching the island, turning Tenochtitlan into a natural fortress. Aqueducts were built to bring fresh water from springs on the mainland. As the lake itself was brackish and undrinkable, these stone channels carried clean water into the heart of the city, a feat of engineering that would impress even the Spanish conquistadors who later arrived. The city was laid out in a grid pattern around a central sacred precinct. 4 main causeways extended outward in the cardinal directions, dividing the city into quarters. Each quarter was subdivided into calpulli, which were something between neighborhoods and kinship groups. Each calpulli had its own temple, school, and leadership. This organization provided both structure and flexibility, allowing the city to grow while maintaining social cohesion. The Great Temple, the Templo Mayor, began as a modest structure but would grow through successive rebuildings, each new ruler covering the old temple with a larger, grander one. This pyramid would eventually tower over the city, dedicated to both Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, the ancient rain god. The dual dedication reflected the twin pillars of Mexica existence, military conquest and agricultural abundance. The year 1428 marked a turning point. The tyrannical ruler of Azcapotzalco had died, and his successor Maxtla proved cruel and demanding. He increased the tribute demands on subject cities and murdered the Mexica ruler Chimalpopoca, perhaps fearing the growing strength of Tenochtitlan. This was a fatal miscalculation. The new Mexica ruler Itzcoatl refused to bow. He formed an alliance with 2 other cities that resented Tepanec domination, Texcoco and Tlacopan. This triple alliance would reshape the political landscape of Mesoamerica. The war against Azcapotzalco was swift and decisive. The combined forces of the 3 allied cities overwhelmed the Tepanecs. Maxtla was captured and sacrificed. Azcapotzalco was destroyed as a political power. The tables had turned completely. The former vassals were now masters. In the aftermath of victory, the 3 cities formalized their alliance. Tribute from conquered territories would be divided between them, with Tenochtitlan and Texcoco each receiving 2/5, and Tlacopan 1/5. But from the beginning Tenochtitlan dominated. The Mexica had the largest population, the strongest army, and the most ambitious leaders. Itzcoatl and his chief advisor Tlacaelel undertook a remarkable project. They rewrote history. They gathered all the old codices, the painted books that recorded the histories of the valley's peoples, and burned them. In their place, they created a new official history that placed the Mexica at the center of cosmic destiny. According to this revised narrative, the Mexica were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, destined to rule and to feed the sun with the blood of sacrificial victims. This ideological revolution justified endless expansion. War became not merely political or economic but sacred duty. The universe itself required Mexica conquests. The sun needed blood to continue its daily journey across the sky. Without constant sacrifice, the world would end. This belief system, whether genuine faith or cynical propaganda, provided powerful motivation for the military machine that would conquer an empire. Itzcoatl was succeeded by his nephew Moctezuma I, who ruled from 1440 to 1469. Under his leadership, the Mexica expanded their dominion dramatically. Armies marched east to the Gulf Coast, securing the tropical lowlands and their valuable resources. They pushed south into Oaxaca, conquering Mixtec and Zapotec territories. They campaigned in the west, though the fierce Tarascan kingdom checked their expansion in that direction. The empire grew through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and diplomatic maneuvering. Conquered cities were generally allowed to keep their own rulers, provided they paid tribute, supplied warriors when called upon, and worshipped Huitzilopochtli alongside their own gods. Rebellions were crushed mercilessly, with leaders executed and populations enslaved or sacrificed. Moctezuma. I faced not only human enemies but natural disasters. A series of floods devastated Tenochtitlan in the 1440s and 1450s. The king of Texcoco, the poet-philosopher Nezahualcóyotl, helped design an elaborate dike system to protect the city. This engineering project demonstrated the sophisticated technical knowledge of Mesoamerican civilizations. Worse than floods came famine. In the years 1450-1454, a combination of drought, frost, and crop failure created desperate conditions. People sold themselves into slavery for food. The disaster reinforced the religious ideology. The gods were angry and hungry. More sacrifices were needed. More wars must be fought to capture victims for the altars. The reign of Axayacatl, from 1469 to 1481, saw both triumphs and setbacks. He conquered the neighboring city of Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city and commercial rival. This gave the Mexica control of the greatest marketplace in Mesoamerica. He also expanded territory to the west and south. But Axayacatl also suffered the empire's most significant military defeat. He led an invasion into Tarascan territory, where his army was crushed. Thousands of Mexica warriors died. The Tarascans, with their bronze weapons and different military tactics, proved more than a match for Mexica forces. After this disaster, the empire never again seriously challenged the Tarascans, focusing instead on consolidating control in other directions. Axayacatl was followed by his brother Tizoc, whose reign was brief and undistinguished. Tizoc proved ineffective as a military leader, and his lackluster conquest disappointed the warrior nobility. He died after only 5 years, possibly poisoned. His younger brother Ahuitzotl succeeded him, and proved to be one of the most successful military leaders in Mexica history. Ahuitzotl ruled from 1486 to 1502, expanding the empire to its greatest extent. His armies campaigned constantly, pushing the border south to modern Guatemala, east to the Gulf Coast, and consolidating control over rebellious provinces. Under his leadership, the tribute system reached peak efficiency, with hundreds of subject cities sending their payments to Tenochtitlan. The rededication of the Great Temple in 1487 marked the zenith of Mexica power and religious fervor. The pyramid had been rebuilt on a massive scale, towering over the city. For the dedication ceremony, thousands of captives were brought to Tenochtitlan. Over several days they were sacrificed atop the pyramid. Spanish sources would later claim 80,000 victims, though modern historians consider this number exaggerated. Even if the true number was a fraction of that, it represented a massive ritual killing that sent a clear message to subject peoples. This was the power of Tenochtitlan. The empire's infrastructure expanded dramatically. Road networks connected distant provinces to the capital. Fast runners carried messages across hundreds of miles, covering as much as 200 miles per day through a relay system. News from the farthest provinces could reach Tenochtitlan within days. Military forces could be mobilized and marched to trouble spots with impressive speed. The tribute system became highly organized. Tribute collectors, backed by the threat of military force, ensured that goods flowed steadily to the capital. Subject cities paid according to their resources. Coastal regions sent shells, tropical feathers, and cacao. Mining regions provided gold, jade, and turquoise. Agricultural areas contributed maize, beans, and cotton. Warriors were also demanded as tribute, expanding the empire's military might. Tenochtitlan grew into a true metropolis. By 1500, the population probably exceeded 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The central ceremonial district contained dozens of temples, palaces, and administrative buildings. Markets buzzed with activity as goods from across the empire were bought and sold. Canals served as streets, with canoes carrying people and cargo throughout the city. The palace of the Tlatoani, the ruler, was a vast complex containing not only his residence but also administrative offices, courts, storerooms for tribute goods, an aviary with exotic birds, a zoo with jaguars and other fierce animals, and gardens that displayed the wealth and power of the empire. Aztec society was highly stratified, with clear divisions between nobles and commoners. At the top sat the Tlatoani, the emperor, though that title suggests more absolute power than he actually wielded. The ruler was advised by a council of nobles and relied on the cooperation of the nobility and the merchant class. The nobility, the Pipiltin, held the most important administrative, military, and religious positions. They owned large estates worked by commoners and received tribute from subject communities. Noble children received superior education and were trained for leadership. They wore elaborate clothing, rich jewelry, and consumed foods forbidden to commoners. The bulk of the population were commoners, the Masawaltan. Most were farmers, though many practiced crafts or served in other occupations. Commoners organized themselves through the Kalpuli system, which provided mutual support and collected tribute for the state. They worked the land, served in the army when called, and paid taxes. While their lives were harder than those of nobles, they were free citizens with recognized rights. Below the commoners came the landless poor and slaves. Slavery in Aztec society differed from the chattel slavery that would later develop in the Americas. Slaves could own property, marry, and have children who were born free. People became slaves through debt, crime, or by selling themselves in times of hardship. Some slaves were captives from war, particularly those destined for sacrifice. The Pochteca, the long-distance merchants, occupied a unique position. Though technically commoners, they accumulated wealth that rivaled the nobility. They organized trading expeditions to distant lands, sometimes serving as spies for the empire. Their caravans carried goods hundreds of miles, bringing luxury items to Tenochtitlan: jaguar skins, quetzal feathers, jade, cacao, and rubber. The Pochteca had their own courts, their own gods, and considerable influence in the empire's affairs. Daily life for most people revolved around work, family, and religious observance. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their fields. Women ground maize on stone metates, making the tortillas that formed the basis of every meal. Children helped with household tasks and began learning their parents' occupations from an early age. Education was taken seriously. All children, noble and common, boys and girls, received some formal schooling. Commoner boys attended the Telpachkali, where they learned history, religion, warfare, and citizenship. Noble boys went to the Kalmakak, where they received more advanced education in astronomy, theology, poetry, and leadership. Girls attended separate schools where they learned weaving, cooking, religious ceremonies, and household management. Food varied by social class. Commoners ate mainly maize, beans, squash, and chilies with occasional small game or fish. They drank water or atole, a thin maize gruel. Nobles enjoyed a more varied diet including turkey, dog, venison, and chocolate, which was reserved for the elite. Chocolate was consumed as a frothy drink, often flavored with vanilla or chili, and was so valuable that cacao beans served as currency. Clothing also reflected social status. Commoners wore simple garments of maguey fiber or cotton. Men wore loincloths and cloaks. Women wore skirts and tunics. Nobles dressed in fine cotton decorated with intricate designs, bright feathers, and jewelry of gold, jade, and turquoise. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated who could wear what. A commoner caught wearing noble clothing could be executed. Religious observance permeated daily life. The Aztec calendar was actually two calendars running simultaneously, a 260-day sacred calendar and a 365-day solar calendar. These synchronized every 52 years in a cycle of great significance. Each day was ruled by specific gods and had its own omens. Religious festivals occurred frequently, involving music, dancing, feasting, and often sacrifice. Family life emphasized duty and respect. Parents taught their children through practical lessons and long speeches filled with wisdom and advice. These formal discourses, preserved in texts recorded after the conquest, reveal a culture that valued self-control, hard work, humility, and service to the community. Misbehaving children might be threatened with punishment by the gods more than by parents. Marriage was arranged by families, with matchmakers negotiating between households. The ceremony involved elaborate rituals, including tying the cloaks of bride and groom together, symbolizing their union. Men could have multiple wives if they could afford to support them, though most commoners were monogamous by economic necessity. The Aztec universe was complex, multi-layered, and constantly in flux. The world had been created and destroyed 4 times before. The present world, the fifth sun, was destined to end in earthquakes. This apocalyptic worldview emphasized impermanence and the need to delay the inevitable through ritual and sacrifice. The cosmos had 13 heavens above and 9 underworlds below. Earth stood between, a precarious middle ground where humans lived their brief lives. Gods were not distant abstractions but active forces that required constant attention and nourishment. The relationship between gods and humans was one of mutual obligation. Gods had sacrificed themselves to create humanity. Humans must reciprocate by feeding the gods with their most precious substance, blood. Huitzilopochtli, the tribal god of the Mexica, occupied the highest position in the imperial cult. Each day he battled the forces of darkness to bring forth the sun. He required enormous quantities of blood to sustain his cosmic struggle. Human sacrifice fed Huitzilopochtli, keeping the sun moving across the sky, postponing the end of the world. But the Aztec pantheon contained hundreds of deities. Tlaloc, the ancient rain god, was equally important, controlling the waters that made agriculture possible. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was god of wind, learning, and priesthood. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was a capricious deity associated with night, sorcery, and destiny. The earth goddess Coatlicue gave birth to Huitzilopochtli. Ziptotec, the flayed god, represented renewal and vegetation. Each profession had patron deities. Each city had guardian gods. Different calendar days belonged to different divine forces. Every aspect of existence was imbued with sacred significance. The boundaries between natural and supernatural were permeable. Gods could take human form. Humans could embody divine power. Human sacrifice was central to Aztec religion but was not unique to them. Many Mesoamerican cultures practiced ritual killing. The Aztecs systematized and expanded the practice to unprecedented levels. Most sacrifices involved captives taken in war, though some rituals required specific types of victims: children for Tlaloc, women for earth goddesses, skilled slaves for Tezcatlipoca. The most common method was heart extraction. The victim was held down on a stone altar atop a pyramid. A priest wielding an obsidian blade cut into the chest and removed the beating heart, offering it to the sun. The body was rolled down the pyramid steps. Some victims were then eaten in ritual cannibalism, though this was a religious act, not a dietary practice. Other forms of sacrifice included flaying, drowning, burning, and ritual combat, where an unarmed captive fought armed warriors in a contest he could not win. Modern scholars debate the scale of sacrifice. Spanish accounts claimed tens of thousands killed annually, but these sources were written by conquerors seeking to justify their actions. Archaeological evidence is limited. Its clear sacrifice was common and important, but exact numbers remain uncertain. What mattered more than quantity was the ritual significance and the terror it inspired in subject peoples. Not all religious practice involved bloodshed. Music and dance were forms of prayer. Incense burning, flower offerings, and fasting were important devotions. Pilgrimages to sacred mountains and caves connected worshippers with ancient traditions. Household shrines allowed private devotion. The sacred calendar guided the rhythm of ritual life, with each month bringing different ceremonies and festivals. War was the foundation of Aztec power and prosperity. Young men proved themselves in battle. Nobles rose through military ranks. The empire expanded through conquest. Sacrifice victims were captured in war. Everything in Aztec society ultimately rested on military success. Boys began warrior training in adolescence. They learned to use the macuahuitl, a wooden sword edged with razor-sharp obsidian blades that could decapitate a horse. They trained with the atlotl, a spear thrower that gave greater range and force to darts. They practiced with bows, slings, and clubs. Physical fitness and courage were emphasized above all. A young warrior earned status through capturing enemies in battle. The first captive was a rite of passage, celebrated with feasting and ceremony. Each subsequent capture brought greater honor and rewards. Warriors who captured 4 enemies joined elite military societies, the Jaguar Warriors or the Eagle Warriors. These orders wore distinctive costumes reflecting their animal namesakes and received substantial privileges. Aztec warfare combined ritual and practical elements. Wars often began with formal declarations and followed certain conventions, but battles themselves were brutal and effective. Mexica forces used shock tactics, attempting to overwhelm enemies quickly. They employed scouts, spies, and military intelligence. Supply lines were organized. Strategies were planned by experienced commanders. The goal of battle was not primarily to kill enemies, but to capture them alive for sacrifice. Warriors tried to wound and disable opponents rather than deliver fatal blows. This sometimes put Mexica forces at a disadvantage against enemies who fought to kill, as they would discover when facing the Spanish. The empire conducted 2 types of warfare. Wars of conquest aimed to subjugate new territories and expand the tribute system. These were total wars that continued until the enemy surrendered. Wars of flowers, Xochitlán, were ritual conflicts arranged between rival cities for the purpose of capturing sacrificial victims. These provided combat training and supplied captives without the chaos of full conquest. Military logistics were impressive. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands could be mobilized and supplied. Allies contributed warriors, swelling forces to massive size. Professional warriors formed the core, but all male commoners were subject to military service. Women sometimes accompanied armies, though they didn't fight in battles. Conquest didn't mean direct administration. The Aztec Empire was more a tribute system than a territorial empire. Conquered cities paid tribute and acknowledged Mexica's supremacy, but kept their local rulers and customs. Aztec governors might be installed in strategic locations. Garrisons ensured compliance. But most of the time, local elites found it profitable to cooperate with the empire. Aztec artistic achievement expressed both religious devotion and imperial power. Monumental stone sculpture dominated public spaces. The most famous example, the Sunstone or Aztec calendar stone, was actually not a functioning calendar, but a cosmological representation. This massive circular stone, over 12 feet across, depicted the current age surrounded by symbols of previous world ages, gods, and sacred dates. Stone carving reached extraordinary sophistication. Sculptors created everything from intimate figurines to massive temple decorations. Common subjects included gods, rulers, animals with sacred significance, and scenes from mythology. The style was bold and direct, emphasizing powerful forms and symbolic meaning over naturalistic representation. Aztec architecture impressed even hostile Spanish observers. The Great Temple rose over 150 feet high, its twin staircases leading to shrines for Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The building's orientation and proportions reflected astronomical and religious calculations. Each rebuilding added another layer, creating a pyramid within pyramids, with the oldest structures preserved inside like memories in stone. Palaces housed the nobility in comfort. The Palace of Moctezuma II contained hundreds of rooms organized around multiple courtyards. Some rooms featured murals painted in vivid colors. Gardens displayed rare plants brought from across the empire. The complex included offices, storerooms, workshops, and areas for public audiences. Featherwork was a uniquely Mesoamerican art form that reached its apex with the Aztecs. Specialized craftsmen created elaborate designs using thousands of tiny feathers from tropical birds. The most prized were the iridescent green tail feathers of the Quetzal bird. Featherwork adorned shields, cloaks, headdresses, and decorative panels. The craft required extraordinary patience and skill, with artists selecting and attaching individual feathers to create subtle gradations of color. Metalworking came late to Mesoamerica, but was highly developed by Aztec times. Gold and silver were worked using lost wax casting, creating intricate jewelry and ceremonial objects. Copper was used for tools and weapons, though the technology never fully replaced stone implements. Metals had more symbolic than practical value, representing divine power and natural forces. Pottery ranged from simple cooking vessels to elaborate ceremonial pieces. The distinctive orange-on-cream style decorated with geometric patterns was typical of the period. Some vessels were painted with scenes from mythology or daily life. Clay was also used for figurines, often depicting gods or humans in ceremonial dress. Textiles were a major art form, though few survived the conquest and the humid climate. Women wove cotton and maguey fiber on backstrap looms, creating fabric with complex patterns. Some textiles incorporated feathers, creating shimmering effects. Clothing communicated social status, with nobles wearing garments woven with symbols of their rank and achievements. Lapidary work transformed jade, turquoise, obsidian, and other stones into objects of beauty and power. Jade was especially valued, considered more precious than gold. Skilled craftsmen carved jade into beads, pendants, and figurines using primitive tools and endless patience. Turquoise was fashioned into elaborate mosaic masks and decorations, often combined with shell and precious metals. Codices, painted books made from bark paper or deerskin, recorded history, religious knowledge, tribute lists, and calendrical information. The books folded like screens and were painted with pictographic writing that combined ideographic and phonetic elements. Few codices survived the Spanish conquest, but those that remain provide invaluable insights into Aztec culture and thought. In 1502, Ahuitzotl died, possibly from a head injury sustained when a dike burst and flooded the city. He was succeeded by his nephew Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known to history as Moctezuma II or Montezuma. This ruler would preside over the height of Aztec power and witness its catastrophic collapse. Moctezuma II was about 34 when he became Tlatoani. He had served as a priest before ascending to power and brought a religious intensity to his rule. Early in his reign, he conducted successful military campaigns, expanding the empire and crushing rebellions. He reorganized the government, removing some commoners from administrative positions and restricting certain offices to nobles. Under Moctezuma II, court ceremony became increasingly elaborate. The Tlatoani was elevated to near-divine status, separated from ordinary people by complex protocols. When common people approached the emperor, they had to go barefoot, wear rough clothing, keep their eyes downcast, and address him with extreme deference. This represented a shift from earlier practices when rulers had been more accessible. The empire reached its maximum extent under Moctezuma II, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from northern deserts to modern Guatemala. Hundreds of cities paid tribute to Tenochtitlan. Wealth flowed into the capital in unprecedented quantities. The city sparkled with magnificent buildings, busy markets, and an estimated 250,000 inhabitants. but all was not well. Conquered peoples resented Aztec domination. Some regions repeatedly rebelled, requiring constant military attention. The Tlaxcalans, a confederation of city-states completely surrounded by Aztec territory, remained fiercely independent despite numerous attempts at conquest. They would prove crucial allies to the Spanish. Strange omens troubled Moctezuma and his priests. A comet appeared in the sky. The temple of Huitzilopochtli mysteriously caught fire. A strange bird was captured and brought to the emperor. In its eyes, Moctezuma claimed to see visions of warriors coming from the east. Lightning struck a temple. These portents suggested the gods were warning of coming disaster. Then in 1519, reports reached Tenochtitlan that strange towers had appeared on the eastern sea. Bearded men with pale skin had landed on the coast. They rode enormous deer, actually horses, unknown in the Americas. They possessed weapons that thundered like storms and killed from great distances. They sought gold and asked about the great city in the interior. The Spanish had arrived. Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast with about 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and several cannons. He founded the settlement of Veracruz and burned his ships, eliminating any possibility of retreat. His small force seemed absurdly inadequate to challenge an empire of millions, but Cortés possessed certain advantages beyond military technology. First, he arrived at a moment of political instability. The empire was divided by resentments and rivalries. Subject peoples hated their Aztec overlords. Old enemies like the Tlaxcalans would eagerly ally with anyone against Tenochtitlan. Cortés exploited these divisions masterfully. Second, the Spanish carried invisible weapons far deadlier than their swords and guns. European diseases, particularly smallpox, would devastate the indigenous population, which had no immunity to these new pathogens. These diseases would kill far more people than Spanish arms. Third, Cortés benefited from confusion and miscalculation. Moctezuma initially seemed uncertain how to respond to the strangers. He sent gifts including elaborate gold work, hoping to satisfy the visitors and send them away. But the gold only inflamed Spanish greed. He sent magicians to cast spells against them, but these efforts failed. He consulted his priests and nobles, receiving contradictory advice. Some saw the Spanish as gods. An old legend spoke of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who had once ruled the Toltecs before sailing east on a raft of serpents, promising to return in the year 1 Reed to reclaim his kingdom. According to the Aztec calendar, 1519 was a year 1 Reed. The timing seemed ominous. Most scholars now believe this Quetzalcoatl connection was largely a post-conquest invention, created to explain Aztec behavior and Spanish victory. But there's no doubt the Mexica were deeply troubled by these strange visitors and uncertain how to respond. Cortés marched inland, gathering allies. The Totonacs, recently conquered and still resentful, joined him. More significantly, after initial battles, the fiercely independent Tlaxcalans became his allies. They had resisted Aztec conquest for decades. Now they saw an opportunity to destroy their ancient enemies. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors swelled Cortés' forces. In November 1519, the Spanish reached Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma came out to greet them, carried in a rich litter, shaded by a canopy of quetzal feathers. The meeting between these two men, representing worlds that had developed in isolation for thousands of years, must have been extraordinary. They could not directly communicate, relying on Malintzin, an indigenous woman who served as translator and would become Cortés's mistress and advisor. Moctezuma allowed the Spanish into the city and housed them in a palace. The Spanish were astounded by what they saw. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who left a detailed account, wrote that Tenochtitlan surpassed any European city in size and magnificence. The great market at Tlatelolco bustled with tens of thousands of buyers and sellers. The causeways stretched for miles. The temples and palaces amazed even these hardened conquistadors. But the Spanish were also horrified by the human sacrifice they witnessed. They saw skull racks holding thousands of human remains. They watched sacrificial ceremonies. Their accounts emphasize the bloodshed and brutality, though one must remember these reports serve to justify the conquest to European audiences. The situation was tense but peaceful at first. Then Cortés learned that Moctezuma had ordered attacks on Spanish forces left at the coast. Cortés took a bold, desperate gamble. He seized Moctezuma and held him hostage in his own capital, dictating through the captive emperor. For months, this bizarre situation continued. Moctezuma outwardly remained ruler but was clearly a prisoner. The Mexica nobility seethed with anger, but seemed unable to act decisively. Then Cortés was forced to leave Tenochtitlan to confront a Spanish force sent to arrest him. He defeated these rivals and incorporated them into his army. During Cortés' absence, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado panicked when he learned of a planned Mexica festival. Fearing an attack, or perhaps simply driven by greed for the gold jewelry worn by celebrants, Alvarado ordered his men to seal the exits of the ceremonial courtyard and massacre the unarmed Mexica nobles dancing inside. Hundreds were slaughtered in what became known as the Massacre of Tenochtitlan. This atrocity shattered any remaining possibility of peaceful coexistence. When Cortés returned, he found the city in open revolt. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies were besieged in their palace. Moctezuma tried to calm his people but was struck by stones thrown by angry crowds. Whether he died from these wounds or was killed by the Spanish remains uncertain. His death removed the last restraint on Mexica fury. On June 30, 1520, Cortés ordered a desperate escape attempt. Under cover of darkness and rain, the Spanish tried to flee the city via the Tacuba Causeway, but the Mexica had removed the bridge sections. Warriors in canoes attacked from both sides of the causeway. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by gold they'd looted, drowned in the lake. Horses panicked and fell into the water. The night became chaos and slaughter. By dawn, the survivors had reached the mainland. Cortés wept beneath a tree, mourning his losses. More than half his Spanish soldiers were dead. Nearly all the horses were gone. Most of the Tlaxcalan allies had perished. The Spanish called this La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But Cortés survived, and so did enough men to reconstitute a fighting force. More importantly, smallpox had arrived in Tenochtitlan. The disease spread through the densely populated city like wildfire. People died in their homes, in the streets, in such numbers that bodies couldn't be properly buried. The smell of death hung over the city. Cuitlahuac, who succeeded Moctezuma as Tlatoani, died of smallpox after ruling only 80 days. He was replaced by Cuauhtémoc, a young nobleman described as brave and determined. Cuauhtémoc organized the defense of the city and tried to rally allies, but many subject cities sensed the Aztec Empire was doomed and began defecting to the Spanish side. Cortés spent months building an armada of brigantines, small warships that could sail on Lake Texcoco. He gathered a massive army of indigenous allies, primarily Tlaxcalans, numbering in the tens of thousands. In May 1521, he began the siege of Tenochtitlan. The siege lasted 3 months. Cortés cut the aqueducts, denying the city fresh water. His brigantines controlled the lake, preventing supplies from reaching the city. Day after day, his forces fought their way along the causeways, captured portions of the city, destroyed buildings, and filled in canals. The Mexica fought with desperate courage. They tore up the causeways to slow Spanish advance. They launched nighttime raids. They captured Spanish soldiers and sacrificed them atop the Great Temple, forcing their former comrades to watch. They fought for every street, every building, every inch of their city. But disease, starvation, and thirst weakened the defenders. The smell of corpses became overpowering. People drank the brackish lake water and fell ill. Children wailed with hunger. Still, the Mexica refused to surrender. Cuauhtémoc led by example, fighting alongside his warriors, rallying them when despair threatened to overwhelm resistance. The Spanish and their allies showed little mercy. Quarter by quarter, the city fell. Buildings that had taken generations to build were demolished. Thousands of defenders and civilians died. The carnage was horrific. Spanish accounts described streets choked with bodies, canals filled with corpses, the water stained red with blood. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee the city by canoe. He was captured and brought before Cortés. The last Aztec emperor maintained his dignity, asking Cortés to kill him since he had failed to defend his city. Instead, Cortés kept him prisoner, hoping to use him to find hidden treasure and control the surviving population. Tenochtitlan was destroyed. The great temples were torn down. The palaces were burned. The city that had amazed the Spanish with its beauty now lay in ruins. The survivors, those who hadn't died of disease, starvation, or violence, were expelled from the wreckage. The conquest was complete. The fall of Tenochtitlan didn't immediately end resistance. Spanish forces spent years subduing outlying regions of the empire. Some areas held out for decades, but the heart had been torn from Mesoamerican civilization. The psychological blow of the capital's fall, combined with the devastating impact of European diseases, shattered indigenous political structures. Cuauhtémoc was tortured in an attempt to make him reveal hidden treasure. His feet were burned, but he revealed nothing, perhaps because there was nothing to reveal. In 1525, Cortés took him on an expedition to Honduras and had him hanged on suspicion of plotting rebellion. The last independent ruler of the Mexica died far from his destroyed city. The Spanish built Mexico City directly on top of Tenochtitlan's ruins, using stones from demolished temples to construct churches and colonial buildings. The Great Temple was buried beneath what became the Cathedral Square. For centuries, it remained hidden, its location forgotten as the city grew and changed. European diseases continued to ravage the indigenous population. Smallpox was followed by measles, typhus, and other epidemics. The population of central Mexico, which may have been 15 to 20 million when the Spanish arrived, collapsed to about 1 million by 1600. This demographic catastrophe was the greatest in human history. Whole communities vanished. Languages died. Cultural knowledge disappeared with the elders who held it. The Spanish imposed their religion, government, and language on the survivors. Indigenous religions were suppressed, though many practices continued in secret or blended with Catholic ritual. The old codices were mostly destroyed by zealous priests who saw them as works of the devil. Only a handful survived, preserved by sympathetic friars or hidden by indigenous communities. Yet much did survive. The Nahuatl language spoken by the Aztecs is still used by over 1 million people in Mexico. Place names throughout Mexico derive from Nahuatl. Foods domesticated by Mesoamerican peoples: maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, avocados, chilies, spread around the world and transformed global cuisine. Archaeological work has recovered much that seemed lost. The Great Temple was rediscovered in 1978, when electrical workers accidentally uncovered a massive stone disc, depicting the dismembered goddess Coyolxauhqui. Excavations revealed the pyramid's foundations and thousands of offerings buried during construction phases. These artifacts tell stories the written sources couldn't capture. Modern Mexico has a complex relationship with its Aztec past. The eagle devouring a serpent on a cactus appears on the Mexican flag, directly referencing the founding of Tenochtitlan. Aztec imagery and symbolism appear in art, literature, and political discourse. Yet there's also recognition of the brutality of Aztec imperialism and human sacrifice. The conquest remains controversial. Was it inevitable? Could disease alone have destroyed the empire? How much credit do Spanish military tactics deserve versus the contribution of indigenous allies? These questions continue to generate debate among historians. Our understanding of Aztec civilization comes from multiple sources, each with limitations. Spanish chroniclers left detailed accounts, but these were written by conquerors seeking to justify their actions. They emphasized human sacrifice and portrayed the Aztecs as savage pagans who needed salvation. These sources must be read critically. Indigenous accounts exist but are fewer, and were often recorded years after the conquest. The most famous, the Florentine Codex, was compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, working with Nahua informants. It provides invaluable information about Aztec culture, religion, and history, but was filtered through Spanish colonial perspectives. Archaeological evidence offers physical proof, but requires interpretation. A sacrificial knife is a factual object, but understanding its religious and social context requires careful analysis. Skeletal remains show evidence of sacrifice, but determining the scale and significance requires combining multiple lines of evidence. Modern scholarship has moved beyond simple narratives of Spanish heroes versus savage natives. Research emphasizes the complexity of both Aztec civilization and the conquest. The Aztecs created sophisticated political systems, remarkable engineering works, profound religious philosophy, and significant artistic achievements. They also built an empire through conquest and maintained it through terror and tribute. The conquest wasn't simply Spanish against Aztecs, but rather a multi-sided conflict involving many indigenous groups with their own agendas. The Tlaxcalans weren't passive tools of Spanish ambition, but active participants pursuing their own interests. Disease played a role that no human actor could have anticipated or prevented with the medical knowledge available. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to revise our understanding. The Great Temple excavations revealed elaborate offerings that demonstrate the wealth and religious devotion of the Aztecs. Genetic studies trace the devastating impact of disease and the mixing of populations after conquest. Linguistic research recovers indigenous perspectives from Nahuatl texts. To truly understand the Aztecs requires engaging with their radically different worldview. They saw time as cyclical rather than linear. The past repeated itself in patterns. The future could be known through proper divination. Every moment was charged with sacred significance, determined by the interplay of divine forces. They believed humans lived in a universe that had been created and destroyed multiple times. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create humanity. This imposed an obligation. Humans must nourish the gods through sacrifice to prevent cosmic collapse. This wasn't cruelty, but cosmic duty. Their conception of the self differed from modern Western individualism. A person was embedded in networks of family, calpuli, city, and cosmos. One's identity came from fulfilling social roles and religious obligations. Personal desires mattered less than communal needs. Nature wasn't separate from culture. Mountains were sacred beings. Rivers had spirits. Animals embodied divine forces. The natural world was alive with meaning. Agriculture wasn't simply producing food, but participating in cosmic renewal. War wasn't merely politics, but feeding the sun. Art and beauty had religious and political purposes beyond aesthetic pleasure. A feather headdress wasn't just decorative, but manifested divine power. Poetry praised gods and recorded history. Music allowed communication with the sacred. Nothing existed purely for its own sake. Death was not an ending, but a transformation. Warriors who died in battle or people sacrificed to the gods went to the paradise of the sun god. Women who died in childbirth became divine guides for the sun. Most people went to a neutral underworld, not punishment but continuation. The boundary between life and death was permeable. As you drift toward sleep, consider how the story of the Aztecs echoes across centuries. Their empire lasted less than 200 years, yet their impact persists. They rose from wandering refugees to masters of an empire through determination, military prowess, and religious conviction. They built one of the world's great cities in an unpromising swamp, through engineering genius and coordinated labor. They created art of stunning beauty, and practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. They developed sophisticated astronomy, and believed the sun needed blood to rise. They composed poetry of great depth and waged brutal wars of conquest. They were, like all human civilizations, complex and contradictory. Their story reminds us that civilizations that seem eternal can collapse with shocking speed. The Mexica in 1518 ruled an empire and lived in a magnificent city. 3 years later, their world had ended. Power, no matter how great, can prove fragile. The unexpected, a handful of strangers from across an ocean, microscopic pathogens, can reshape history. Yet their story also shows human resilience. Despite genocide, disease, and cultural suppression, indigenous peoples survived. Languages, traditions, and identities persisted through centuries of colonialism. The descendants of the Aztecs still live in Mexico, maintaining connections to their ancestors while navigating modern life. The Aztec tale is tragedy and triumph, brutality and beauty, human achievement and human folly. It's a reminder that history is never simple, never reducible to heroes and villains. Every civilization contains multitudes, contradictions, people making choices within circumstances they didn't choose, trying to build meaning from chaos. As sleep approaches, let these images fade gently, the Great Pyramids dissolving into mist, the canals of Tenochtitlan becoming rivers of dreams, the sound of drums and flutes softening into silence, the eagle on the cactus taking flight into the darkness, the long march from Aztlan, ending where all journeys end, in rest and renewal. The Aztecs believed in cycles of creation and destruction. Endings were also beginnings. Death fed life. Perhaps there's comfort in that worldview, a acceptance that nothing lasts forever but everything transforms into something new. Sleep now. Let the centuries fold into one another. Let the mighty empire become a whisper on the wind, a memory fading into dream, a story told in darkness to help you rest. The march is over. The battles are done. The temples are quiet. The lake reflects only moonlight. Tomorrow you will wake to your own world, your own time. But tonight, you walked with the Mexica from their uncertain beginning to their tragic end. You witnessed their triumphs and their failures. You saw their world in all its strangeness and familiarity. Now let it all go. Release the weight of history. Drift into the depths of sleep where time has no meaning, where empires rise and fall like breath, where every ending is just another beginning. Rest well. The story is complete. The journey is done. Fade to silence.